Okay, so I'm going to invite our next panelists up, and as they make their way to the front of the room, I'll just do a brief introduction. The Michigan Chemical Company, which was later renamed Velsicol, closed its doors in Michigan in 1978, leaving a toxic legacy of 3 Superfund sites in our state and a residential neighborhood that are still contaminated more than 40 years later. In 1973, the chemical company was responsible for the largest agricultural disaster in U.S. history, not just the state of Michigan, but in the country as a whole. They shipped brominated fire retardants, also known as PBB, instead of a nutritional supplement, which was then mixed in with livestock feed. Millions of Michigan residents consumed farm products containing PBB as a result of that. Dr. Michele Marcus and Jane Keon have been working for over 25 years, but I think it's longer than that.
Well, I've been working
roughly.
for 20 years, but we've been independently working for more than 25 years and partners for more than 10.
Thank you. To understand the long-term human health impacts of that contamination, as well as the long-term economic and social implications of it. I'm delighted to welcome them to the podium, and they are going to talk to you a little bit about their work.
While she is doing this, I would like to encourage those who are trying to get PFAS under the Superfund regulations to ask our legislators to include in that bill a reinstatement of the Superfund tax. There really is no fund anymore. And because there was a Superfund tax on chemical companies, and it was a very small tax, but it built up this fund that could be used to clean up sites such as the ones we have in our community where the responsible party was allowed to go home. And I don't know, DOD is acting like a non-responsible party, so I think if you could get the Superfund tax reinstated and have an actual fund for these cleanups to draw upon, that's a money source, and it should come from the chemical companies. One person told us that the size of the tax on the chemical companies was about equivalent to a family of 4 ordering 1 cheese pizza a year. So it's not an onerous tax. So let's get that done. All right. And one other thing, Linda was talking about how to deal year after year after year with all these new chemicals coming along. And I would like to suggest that we go back even further to the root of the problem and start requiring chemicals to undergo the same rigorous research and testing that pharmaceuticals go under before they are allowed into the human population. Right now, chemical companies can manufacture anything they want, put it out there, and then later when we come and say it's making me sick, they'll say, well, how can you prove that? You're exposed to so many things. So we need to go back to the beginning and get the regulation that they have to do the research, do the testing, make sure it's safe for whatever use they need it in, and it's not going to hurt people. Okay? All right. Now the slides. Where are we going? Here? Yeah. Okay, I'm from St. Louis, Michigan, right here. We're the geographical center of the Lower Peninsula, and if you drive north on 127 and start seeing a bunch of windmills, you'll know that's where we live. St. Louis was known for its healing waters for many, many years, and people would come to St. Louis, many well-known senators back in the 19th century would come to St. Louis to drink the waters and also take baths in them to heal whatever ailed them. And the picture on that side shows an old bottle of the mineral water that was sold. Here's the chemical plant when it was in production, and you'll see that there's neighborhood all around, and the river right through there. And that big white blotch is a contaminant of some sort going out into the river. Michigan Chemical, which later became Velsicol, was manufactured about 250 different chemical compounds in their lifespan. DDT was one of them, and I know some people think that DDT disappeared out of America after Rachel Carson's book came out, but I will show you in a few minutes that it did not, at least in our town. So then when Michigan Chemical became Velsicol Chemical, it continued manufacturing other things. It stopped with the DDT soon after that, but then it got into PBB. And so that is the epicenter of the PBB disaster, and that was the largest, not only agricultural, but the largest food contamination accident in the United States of America until this day, and hopefully there's nothing bigger. There were about 9 million people living in St. Louis at that time, or in Michigan at that time, excuse me. And when it got into the food chain, as Amy told you, we went to the stores, we bought our hamburger, our cheese, our eggs, our milk, and butter, and we all got the PBB in our systems that way. Some of you here are old enough to have gotten it that way. And then later, Michelle's going to show how it isn't just you who are exposed, it's your offspring, it's your grandchildren. So the best book on the whole PBB disaster is The Poisoning of Michigan. I highly recommend that you read it. So after the PBB disaster, the state of Michigan decided they did not want Velsicol in the state anymore. And Velsicol was able to work out a deal with the federal government and the state government to leave. They had to pay a little bit of money to buy clay so that the plant site could be covered up. But the 52-acre chemical plant site, everything on it was demolished. The buildings, the towers, the pipes, the railroad tracks, it's all buried right there. A clay cap was put over, a clay wall was put around. Subsequent years, we found that there were gaps in the wall 10 feet wide, so I don't know how much good it did. And then we were left with warning signs on the fence and a tombstone out there, which said, do not go on this property because of the chemical and radioactive contamination. And it was, as you saw in the first picture, it's right in a neighborhood. It's right downtown. It's like 1 block from downtown. So we lived with that tombstone a long time, and if you're interested in more detail about our group and what we've been doing for the last 22 years, my book is called Tombstone Town, and it covers the first 16 years of our group and tells you the stories, but also gives other groups getting started some ideas from what we went through of how you can handle dealing with the agencies and dealing with, if you have a responsible party, with a responsible party. So I'll put that out there. It's available on Amazon, and it's called Tombstone Town. So we started the Pine River Superfund Citizen Task Force in 1998. This is the second time around. Remember, the first time the chemical company was, the chemical site was all just buried, and then it leaked into the river, and we finally got EPA to come back and do some testing of the sediments. And water sediments are, if I remember right, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember that it was 250 parts per million in the sediment. They would clean up a body of water, of DDT. And out here in the river around the plant site, there were hot spots of 32,000, 46,000 parts per million DDT. And when they started digging it out, it was like pure product in some places. So this is after, you know, that beautiful lawn there is part of the buried chemical plant. And the first job that we got EPA to do was clean up the sediment in the riverbed. And this picture shows the river But over there where it's dry land, that was also a river. They put sheet piling in to section it off, and they dewatered the part that was not too polluted on top, and then as they got down, the water would be piped to that circus tent there, and it was a water treatment plant, and they would treat the water there before it was returned to the river. And then they built that road across. Trucks would go over there, and they'd dig out the sediments, truck them back, let them drip dry. Again, the water would go through the treatment plant, and then the trucks hauled the dried out sediments to hazardous waste facilities around Michigan. We can talk about that later. So we also had a radioactive site, low-level radioactive site, where the chemical plant had buried their filter cake and other wastes out east of St. Louis. And we had to work a long, long time, but we finally got the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to authorize a cleanup of that. And that waste was dug up, put in these super sacks. The company that did it had their own train cars. The waste was trucked or trained out to Utah, where they owned their own land down in rock, and that's where it's buried. So guess what? We had contamination in our drinking water wells. And the main contaminant was PCBSA, which is a byproduct of the DDT manufacturing. And it was a long battle. St. Louis City, little city of St. Louis, had to take not only Velsicol to court, but on Velsicol's side were the EPA, the Department of Justice trust that had been set up for these problems, the Department of Justice, US DOJ itself. So it was a David against Goliath kind of situation, but it was settled, and St. Louis got $26.5 million to start finding new water source, and it took a while because any wells they drilled anywhere near St. Louis just kept drawing that contaminated groundwater in. So they're 10 miles away now, and they had to put in new wells 10 miles away, and then it's piped all the way to St. Louis. Not cheap. It's about $55 million so far in that. They're not finished yet. So in the neighborhood around the plant site, people kept finding dead robins and other birds in the late spring, early summer. And we tried to get at DEQ at that time or EPA to do a study, and they wouldn't. They had their set agenda. They were going to just do this. They were not going to do that. And so we actually used some of our money and hired a wildlife toxicologist to come in and do a study. And the birds were collected and found to have died of acute DDT poisoning. This is 40-some years after Rachel Carson's book. Okay, that meant that the worms in the ground, the soil, was still highly contaminated. And so the toxicologist trained a bunch of our residents to do dead bird collections. We did an actual study of the dead birds, and these birds came back healthy from the south, and they mated, they built their nest. A lot of them laid eggs and even had some babies hatch. And then the parents died, so everybody died. And we had 2 streets in that neighborhood that had 0 nesting success. None of the robins were able to create their young. So as a result, we were able to get 12 blocks of residential yards dug up and replaced with clean soil. PBB and DDT in their yards at different places were higher than direct contact level. So they couldn't, they were fenced off with orange snow fencing so that the children wouldn't get in there, or the pets. So this is what's going on right now, although this was a year ago. Everything was buried, right, at the chemical plant, including the chemicals. And all of the waste products are down there. They identified with testing several hot spots on the plant site, and incineration is often best for a lot of chemicals to just get rid of them. But they didn't, these were so volatile and so dangerous, including DBCP, if anybody's a chemist here and knows how dangerous that one is. And different kinds of NAPLs were down there. So they decided to use this system of underground incineration in a sense. And what they do is they put heating elements down in the ground, 30 feet deep, down to the till layer, and heat the ground up to boiling. And then as the gases come up and the liquids come up, they're captured in extraction wells, and then they're run through separate treatment plants. The stack shows where the final steam from the volatiles went out, and then all the blue tanks are massive carbon filters that are filtering the water, and then the water's returned to the river when it's done. This is looking down one of the heating wells. I kind of like this picture. So I would go around and talk to Rotary clubs and Lions clubs and Alma Women's Club and all that. And before PowerPoints, I'd have these boards, and I'd say, okay, here's where we are with the river impoundment, here's where we are with the Breckenridge site, and so on. But notice the health study has red ink around it and a star. That's because we couldn't get anybody to do a health study, and we tried. NIHS turned us down twice. The first time, I kind of like this, they said, you've never had a health study in your town, so we can't come and do a health study. So, and CDC and ATSDR, and we'd make a little progress, and then it would fall and nothing would happen. Part of the problem is St. Louis is 4,500 people. Gratiot County is 40,000 people, and a lot of these studies need 100,000 people minimum. So anyway, then they found us, we found them. The Emory researchers were researching PBB, and ever since 2013, we have teamed up together, and it's very exciting to be able to report to the community, yes, this health study was done. Yes, you're right. We do have a real problem with thyroid cancer in this community. You know, people still want to know. After all these years, they really want to know, are our health problems due to having lived here and raised our children here? And we're able to answer those questions. There's one question that they're working on right now that we hope is going to be good news instead of bad news, and that is a possible way to help your body eliminate the PBB and the DDT from your system. Now I'll turn it over to Michele so she can talk about that. Thank you.
So thank you, Jane. So how did I get involved in this question of PBBs? And it was in the early 1990s, and I got involved because of a concern about chemicals in the environment that might be impacting our endocrine system. And I was at Emory University, which many of you may know is right next door to the CDC. And so I became involved at the National Center for Environmental Health at the CDC. And at the time, this book had just come out, Our Stolen Future, by Theo Colburn, who was a biologist with the National Wildlife Federation. And she was noticing that there were all these reports coming in of immune function problems in wildlife populations with feminization of male fish and reptiles. And actually, there were big headlines when someone found reduced penis size in alligators, and that got a lot of attention, and reduced fertility. And so this is really a follow-on to Rachel Carson, who really warned us against DDT. And what these authors were telling us about is all of the synthetic chemicals that we've made since then. And, this shows just the dramatic rise of all of these novel synthetic chemicals that have entered commerce in the last 50 years. And it's important to note that these chemicals were synthesized because they had very important industrial uses, and they were never meant to be in our bodies, but they get there, and we have to live with the consequences. So at the time, as I said, these all these effects in wildlife were being noticed, and at the same time, there were trends in human health effects that related to the endocrine system. For example, girls were maturing earlier, and this trend has continued. There were declining sperm counts across North America and Europe that was documented. There was an increase in urinary and genital defects of newborn boys, and increases in breast and testicular cancer. So what Dick Jackson, who was head, of the National Center for Environmental Health at the time, put together a panel of scientists, both academic scientists and CDC scientists, and asked us to evaluate the literature and tell CDC whether this was an imminent threat to public health. And so we carefully examined what was known, and these are the two, really big chunks of evidence that we had. And there were, some animal toxicology studies, but they weren't really looking at the critical period of exposure where they might be more vulnerable to these chemicals. And so what we suggested is that there be that we needed a human study where we could document individual exposure levels. So we're not looking at what's happening over time, because lots of things are happening over time, not just the increase in synthetic chemicals. And, rats aren't people. We want to see what's happening in people. And I had known about this, PBB horror because I had been at Mount Sinai School of Medicine before I came to Emory and worked with the great Irving Selikoff, who determined that asbestos caused mesothelioma, and Phil Landrigan, who was involved in the beginnings of studying the health effects of PBB, along with Dr. Selikoff. And I said, there's like thousands, millions of people who were exposed to PBB, which, based on the animal studies, certainly seems to be impacting the endocrine system. It seems to be acting like a weak estrogen. And, what we were particularly concerned about is, the developing child in the womb. And, this, we now are aware because, oh my goodness, 3 minutes. Okay. We're aware that, a medication that is harmless to an adult can be devastating to a developing child. And these chemicals that interfere with the endocrine system, they're like unregulated medicines. And so, we've worked closely with the community, and here is, some quotes from people who were impacted. I didn't know that something that I was exposed to could be passed to my kid. Did I poison my kid? And we did look at early puberty, and sure enough, we found that the girls who were exposed in the womb and through breastfeeding, because this chemical is stored in fat, and breast milk has a very high fat content. So in fact, the girls who were exposed in the womb and through breastfeeding had their earlier menstrual period. And, on average, it was only 1 year on average. So I talked to the scientists in the room. When you sample a population, you miss the tails. You miss the people. This family was not in our study, but I presented this to the community, and a woman came up to me and told me that her daughter had her first period at 5. And then these girls are now adults because we're able to follow multiple generations, and they have a dose-related increase in the risk of miscarriages, and that exposure dose is their mother's blood level at the time that she was pregnant with them. And one of our partners has said, to this day, I grieve for my lost children, and she had over 10 miscarriages. We found thyroid disorders, and now you're going to hear these, echoes of what Linda Birnbaum talked about for PFAS. One of our community partners had suffered with abnormal thyroid function for 2 years before it was diagnosed. And it turns out that he had a high PBB level, and if he had known that he was at increased risk of thyroid problems, if his doctor had known, then he could have been diagnosed much sooner and could have been treated. And I should also say that this particular person was not a chemical worker. He didn't have high exposure because he worked in the chemical plant. He didn't even live near the chemical plant, but he had a family, an uncle, I think, who lived right across the street from the chemical plant. And as a child, the kids would go play on the property in piles of what they thought were sand. And they would throw it around, they'd climb up and climb down, and it was laced with PBB. And he had very high levels of PBB. So we also found that the boys who were exposed in the womb, so we said the girls matured earlier, the boys actually had more problems in the development of the urinary and the genital tract, and slower growth and pubertal development. So, the development of the endocrine system in boys and girls who are different, and they're different because of, mostly because of the balance between estrogen and testosterone. Both sexes make both hormones, but girls make much more estrogen, boys make much more testosterone. And so when you have a chemical that acts like estrogen, it accelerates the girls' development and it slows down the boys. And during this sort of critical period where the male genital tract is developing, the estrogen can interrupt that. So we also found, and we and other investigators who have looked at this population over time have found an increased risk of lymphoma, of digestive system cancers, and of breast cancers. Now, as Linda said, in order to look at cancers, you need a very large population, and in fact, we recently got funded to look at cancer again, and we want to look at the largest population that's possible, which is everybody that was originally enrolled in the registry. And so the reason that we were able to do all of this research is because the state health department had the foresight in the late 1970s to enroll 5,000 people in a long-term registry to monitor the health effects, because nobody knew what the health effects would be. And that's how we have learned everything that I've told you about so far. And now we need to do this again to update the data, particularly now that the younger generation is reaching the age where they are developing cancers. And so we can get a much more accurate estimate. And so we are waiting for the health department to approve our application to study the entire cohort once again for cancers and mortality. Now, we've also tried to understand on a molecular level, on a biological level, how this chemical could be causing the health effects that we're seeing. And so I'm going to mention briefly epigenetics. Now, epigenetics is upon the gene. It's how genes are regulated. So you've got the same strand of DNA in every cell in your body. That's why you can send a blood sample to Ancestry.com and it's your entire DNA sequence, okay? But how do the cells know to do their specific job? The blood cells make different proteins than the heart cells, than the muscle cells, and the bone bone cells. And it's through this regulation of which genes are turned on and turned off in different cells, okay? So it increases the activity of genes. So we looked at what does PBB do to this gene regulation, and in fact we found that it stimulates the same genes that estrogen does. And it also impacts immune function, and we've seen that the people with high PBB exposure actually have accelerated aging, that their cells are acting like they're older than their chronological age. We've also seen changes in the sperm. And this, raises the question of whether a father's exposure could impact his children and grandchildren. And so we're doing a study right now of 3 generations with the father who's exposed and not the mother. Amy's giving me the eye here. So I just want to say that, PFAS was not the first forever chemical. DDT, dioxins, PCBs, PBPs, they all accumulate. They're resistant to degradation. They have a long half-life in humans. When I was a kid, we would talk about throwing things away. There is no away for these chemicals. You just move it from one place to the other. And if we keep making them, they're just going to pile up. So we found that 40 years later, 60% of the people that we tested still had elevated levels. I'm not going to explain the chart because I don't have time. And we're now working with the community to answer their questions. We're developing a continuing medical education course to inform healthcare providers. We're doing, as Jane mentioned, a clinical trial trying to help people speed the elimination. And we're doing this multi-generational study. We know that the children of women who were exposed are directly exposed in the womb and through breastfeeding, but what about the children of fathers who are exposed? Could these epigenetic changes be passed on to their children? So what have we learned in 40 years of research on this population? It's a forever chemical transferred from mother to child. It impacts the reproductive system, the thyroid system, cancers. 3 generations have impacted, and it changes the way we regulate our genes. And, I just want to say, one more word about this community partnership, which has changed everything for us. And why are we doing this work in the first place? It's really to help protect human health. So why aren't we always working with the communities that are impacted to give them the information that they need to protect their health? For example, we need to let people know that they could be at an increased risk of breast cancer. So they don't say, oh, I don't have a family history, maybe I'll skip my mammogram this year. Don't do it. If you lived in Michigan during the time of this disaster, between 73 and 75, you probably consumed contaminated food. I want to say one more thing, which is that every community that has dealt with a toxic event, a toxic contamination, has had to fight alone. We're all here in this room because we need to fight together. And Amy's going to tell you the rest of the day is, how do we do this? How do we strengthen these partnerships and help each other? Thank you.
I just want to say we have asked the impossible of our speakers today to talk about a huge amount of information in a very short period of time, and I really appreciate people trying to slog through. We do have about 5 minutes for questions and answer, so we'll open the floor for that, including for folks on the webinar. And just as a reminder to ask our speakers to repeat the question into the mic. Okay. So, questions? We have one in the back.
Hi, I have a question for Michele. So you said something, my name is Andrea, I'm from Fort Smith, New Hampshire. I'm an impacted community member with PFAS. And you said something that really resonated with me, that the State Health Department in Michigan in the 70s had the foresight to register 5,000 people to follow them. And when I think about all the community members I talk to across the nation with PFAS, we have to fight tooth and nail just to get our state health departments to even acknowledge this is a significant issue, that the health effects are real, and the science is, the science is still evolving. What do you think has changed? Because I think community members would love our state health departments to have foresight, register us all, follow us over time, follow our children that have been exposed. Why are we seeing such a shift now with PFAS versus what happened in the 70s?
Okay, I'll repeat the question, which is, you know, the reason we have learned and been able to study the people who were exposed to PBB is because the state health department had the foresight to establish a registry so that people, that we could do surveillance on the long-term health effects. I don't know what has changed, and I don't know why there hasn't been an establishment of a PFAS exposure registry. There has been establishment of a lead exposure registry in Flint, and hopefully that will help us understand not just the impact of lead on the community, but whether the interventions to try and reduce the impact of the lead are working so that we can mitigate. Again, that's the other important thing. We want to prevent exposures, and if they occur, we want to help the community to mitigate the toxic consequences of that exposure. So it's very, very important. And when people say, you know, we don't know the health effects of PFAS, you know, besides the fact that Linda pointed out we know a lot about the health effects of PFAS, but we won't know unless a large group of people have their levels measured and followed. That's the only way we will know.
Stated that with the cancer research, you're going to be able to open up the registry for the original 5,000. Does that mean you're going to have access to all those records, or are you still fighting for access to those records?
Go right ahead, Michele.
Okay, thank you, Jane Ann. Jane Ann Crowley is one of our community advisors, and we've been working together for, 10 years now. And she asked, will we have access to the entire PBB registry? And the answer is we don't yet know. We have been waiting for over a year to get an approval from the health department to update the cancer data. And they had approved this several times in the past, and that's how we have learned what we have learned, but the cancer studies that were done previously, there were only a very small number of cancers. There were, I think it was 10 lymphomas, 12 gastrointestinal cancers. Our latest breast cancer study had 51 cases of breast cancer, but that was based on data cancers diagnosed 20 years ago. So we've gotten funding now to update this. And as Linda said, we need the largest population in order for this to be most valuable and most precise. And we are waiting. You said, what's different about the health department? I don't know. They have not yet given us the go-ahead to do this work that has been funded by NIEHS and by Emory University in order to update the cancer surveillance on this cohort.
Well, thank you, Michele and Jane, for a fabulous presentation. It really, I think, sets the stage again for the work that we have to do yet. So please join me in thanking them.